Hello everybody. I hope you're all doing relatively well in the science friction of the present moment of our civilization, or our so-called civilization. You may notice I have a bit of a froggy throat. That's pretty common these days. It's springtime. So I'm not taking that as any sign of anything other than there's some mucus in my throat. I go for walks just about every day, and I certainly prefer to walk around. I came here to examine something, but I've discovered something extremely troubling accidentally, though I was able to see it from far away. And I'll show you what that is in a little while. I'm a very curious person by nature, and I tend to be curious about things that the majority of people would ignore. So I notice small details. Throughout my entire life, I've been fascinated by what we might refer to as anomalies. I've been both a fan of science as a way of learning and a profound opponent of its applications as practiced by corporations and human supercultures and so on and so forth. Although when I was younger, I was primarily just a fan. I've read more than a few thousand science fiction stories and many fantasy stories. And I've often believed, as I've said before, that if there were going to be, one of the places modern prophets might hide would be as science fiction authors. But they hide other places as well. They hide sometimes in plain sight, sometimes as other kinds of authors, sometimes as teachers, sometimes as artists. Now, I have a variety of things on my mind, but I'm still rather troubled by the discovery I made after I began recording this video. A discovery I will share with you at some point, without proposing too much of an explanation for it. I'm walking around the bocce fields, or bocce, I think that's the correct pronunciation. As my friend Ryan Firstdiver would say, this is very obviously a human attempt to take something that is non-angular and form it into a rectangle. And my friend Ryan and I have both made videos entitled "Beware the Rectangles." So as I was saying before a phone call interrupted, my friend and I, Ryan Firstdiver, have both made videos entitled "Beware the Rectangles," in which we discuss how humans produce these shall I put it, peculiarly regularized structures. And in fact, if you look around in your house or wherever you are where humans are making things, what you're going to see are things like this, right? And things like this. And things like those other things in the distance. You'll see rectangles. A whole bunch of them. In fact, the rectangles will have rectangles which have rectangles. In your homes, you'll see doors and windows and tables and sinks and bathtubs and on and on and on, books and video screens and smartphones and so on and so forth. And what you'll see all over the place there are rectangles. So many of them that we should be suspicious, right? If it's that blatant and we never noticed that everything we were making was rectangular pretty much, like this sign right here. And of course these ball fields and this sign and this gate and the thing I'm recording on and all these things, they're all rectangles. These buildings, right, the windows, everything, the doors, the carpets. It's not like we don't make anything else, but we sure make a lot of rectangles, and that's not a feature that you see in living places very often. So right now I'm between two rectangles. And they're fenced, and they're re-rectangled within themselves, right? They're not, no one was satisfied to just make a rectangle, or actually these fields are relatively square, though I suspect them of being rectangular. No, they had to make rectangles within rectangles within rectangles, like the fencing here, and that door, and this building, and so on and so forth. So that's not really my topic, but I happen to be in this area and it's extremely regularized. And the more a thing is regularized, the more we might feel we can control or predict its outcome. And of course, the problem with prediction is that the more stuff you kill, the better your predictions look. Because living things, living environments, living places, living beings resist prediction to varying degrees. And of course, most of what we call prediction is based, at least if it's rational, on logic and probability and mathematics, models. And models always capture only a part of what's going on. There's no model that captures the entirety of any phenomenon that I'm aware of, but hey, if you know of an exception, by all means let me know. So right now we're living in a time when our societies are transforming based on models. And some people are very upset about this and claim that the models can't be true. I've heard claims that viruses don't exist, pathogens don't cause disease, PCR testing doesn't work, and, you know, lots of other complex claims like this is all a plot to take away our freedoms, as if we had many freedoms before anyway, because if we did, I gotta say we were not really practicing them much. Or the ways we were practicing them were mighty timid. As I've said before, rights are not possessions. They're something that is either enacted and defended, or they exist only in language, right? They're just abstract ideas. So we are caught up in a variety of storms, and the storms are happening between different elements in a constellated system, or something we could think of in a constellated system of individuals and groups and subgroups and supergroups and the organs that the anatomy of our society is comprised of. And most of those organs are phony. They don't actually act like the organs in the body of an organism, or the features of an ecology that serve organ, functions we might analogize as being organ-like. By the way, from the place I'm standing, you may occasionally hear people drumming far away. Yesterday, I participated in a Zoom conference with a microbial pathologist who specializes in mucosal pathology and who is working on, is apparently on a team who is working on a vaccine. I've just observed two people walk right by what I'm going to show you later, which is actually pretty surprising, although I walked by it too. I'm just curious if anyone will notice the thing that I'm going to show you later, because it really stands out. But so far, nobody who I've seen walk by it has noticed it at all, which isn't incredibly surprising. In any case, yesterday I participated in a discussion with a microbiologist that specializes in specific types of pathogens, and in particular in how they enter the body. And there's a good analogy there to the human relationship with language, concepts, models, ideas, probabilities, predictions, assertions. In the beginning of the presentation, there was a very peculiar slide that I liked a lot, and I may be misremembering it, but I think I've got it right. In it were 3 cards that looked a lot like tarot cards, but they were larger, and they were arranged horizontally from left to right. And in each one of them, if I recall correctly, and I may not, and this could be my own projection, there was a figure of death, a skeleton, right, costumed in some way, uniquely in each card, and it was reaching for or had its arm around a human being. And the first card on the left was the state, and the card in the middle was science, and the card on the upper left, since they were staggered, was religion. And some of the things that I learned during the conference were very surprising, not because they related particularly to science, but they related to another thing I'm fascinated by, the evolution of human consciousness. How the consciousness that we have today evolved over, vast portions of what we suppose to be our history. We have no reason to believe that we don't have a history, right? We think, in modern times, we think that we evolved from some kind of animal, eventually producing our most distant ancestors, which continue to evolve both physically and cognitively until they became, us modern people. And that's a model. And it's a pretty new one. It's probably less than 3 human lifespans old. So that's a brand new model. And most of the science that we think of as being profoundly effective and advanced and intelligent is less than 2 lifetimes old. It's super fucking new. We only recently, we being researchers and popular human beings, only recently discovered that half of the cells in our bodies this is something I discovered over 25 years ago, were bacterial, and that was important. So half of us is not human, right? Half of us doesn't come from your parent's sperm meeting your, father's sperm meeting your mother's egg. Half the cells in your body approximately don't come from that origin. They're acquired after we are born. And without them, we won't live. And for most of the history of pharmaceutical technology, we've been really busy attacking and genetically transforming in catastrophic ways that half of our human biome. And it's analogous to what's going on in the world with nature, right? If you look just behind me, you can see this stuff, right? This weird structure-y stuff that actually doesn't belong here. So, religion's a bit older. In fact, religion is the oldest of the three, most likely. The state is a relative newcomer as well, but not as immature as science is, not as new as science, not as young as science. And the state is something that emerged with settled populations and city-states and so on, and the idea of nations and this and that. But one of the things that struck me very profoundly yesterday, a couple of the things, was that I'd never really seen those three elements arrayed together meaningfully. And I never really saw them necessarily as causes of death or rescue, at least not in the way that I perhaps misinterpreted this image. But what occurred to me was that most of us exist in a between place, right? We are between the state, science, and religion. And obviously there's a context in which those cards are placed, and that context is what we might refer to as nature. And so we live in space in a way, and humans do strange things with space, right? And eventually I'll show you something rather terrifying that someone did with space, the thing that I discovered when I got here. But we'll leave that for later. So we live in space, and when we were talking about disease yesterday, the microbial pathologist mentioned a couple of things that were really interesting, and one of them was that the word that we use for one disease that I believe is caused by a parasite, malaria, is literally, the translation is simply bad air. Mal in Latin, I think, is bad, and air is obvious, right? So malaria simply means bad air. And it's interesting that the pathogen for malaria is, if I understand it correctly, and I may be wrong, primarily transmitted through, the bites of mosquitoes. And there's a disease, I may have it wrong, it might be Tay-Sachs, but there's a genetic disease that we'd like to eliminate that actually evolved to protect. One of its peculiar features is that it protects people from getting malaria. So this bad air idea is very old, and in case it's not clear, before we had science, I'm pretty sure that this guy named Semmelweis was involved in developing the theory that we had to sterilize instruments for surgeries and stuff like this. His mother died of sepsis in childbirth. I'm fairly sure he died of sepsis in an insane asylum. But when he first introduced the idea that pathogens were responsible for disease that resulted from surgeries, including childbirth, everyone thought he was mad. And they didn't believe that there could be anything that you can't see that could possibly be causing the deaths that they accounted. They just presumed were the natural result of being subjected to medicine, which is kind of weird. And so, like many other pioneers in science, he was laughed out of the academy and shamed and so on and so forth. Eventually, of course, people realized that if you just do the thing he asked you to do, sterilize the instruments, the death rate goes down, math wins. Obviously there's something going on with the instruments. By the way, they were using instruments that they had recently used to dissect cadavers, those same instruments unwashed, in operations, to assist women in childbirth. So they're using, and they thought that was a great idea. Surely the future will show our own ignorance as moderns in a similar light, in various domains of things that we believe to be true. And surely in some things related to, the nature of disease and transmission and so on and so forth. We live in the very early days of science. No matter how advanced it may appear, no matter how seemingly miraculous our technologies look, they are wildly incomplete, and nature is unimaginably more sophisticated than anything that we can possibly get a grip on with science or models or technology. Roger Penrose, a brilliant physicist, once said something recently. I saw a quote of his, and he's somebody who I find both brilliant and entertaining. He said something like, I'm a materialist, but I object to that label because it implies that we understand what material is. And that's a really intelligent researcher. But we are in the early days of science, and most of what we've done with science and even with our intelligence is make things, right? So we're really sort of uncannily skillful at making objects like this smartphone or those cars or this fence or these buildings. We're really good at making multi-component objects. Hummingbird war. And we're good at making representations. We're good at making pictures, right? Representations and objects are most of what we've done with our intelligence, and those might be the wrong fucking things to be doing with it. In fact, I'm going to suggest blatantly that those things are a bad idea and will get us in lots of trouble, which should be pretty obvious that that's been going on. I mean, people will say, well, there hasn't been a nuclear war yet. Well, I don't know. There's been 2,500 nuclear explosions since we invented the atomic bomb. That looks about like a nuclear war to me. 2,500 nuclear bombs going off? Yeah, that looks about like a nuclear war. Even though we didn't actually drop them on each other's countries directly, we poisoned the environment for, thousands of years to come. And not just with bombs, but with chemistries and antibiotics and pesticides and so on and so forth. We're really good at making toxic shit, apparently. And we're fast, as a species, we're extremely, effulgent in our capacity to do so. We just want to make like billions of gallons of pesticides, apparently, because that turns into this other weird representation we call money. And money is, a disease in its own right. But most of these problems go back to a transformation in the kind of animal that we are. The transformation that I would argue or suggest resulted in us becoming formally representational cognitive animals. We have formal systems with which we represent events, phenomenon, habits of distinction, habits of evaluation, and we have tokens. We produce tokens. For example, the token for that thing there in my language is tree. And that's a really much more complex thing than it appears on the surface. I'm really curious if this guy with a dog is going to be able to pass the object. The dog noticed, but the man didn't. The dog didn't pay a lot of attention, but I was pretty sure the dog was going to notice the object. In any case, we have tokens, and the tokens they're framed in a tree-like structure that begins with what I call a uniphore at the top of the tree. A common uniphore would be everything or the universe. And whatever you think about that thing at the top of the tree, all the things below it acquire characteristics and meanings, denotations and connotations, which are associations, from whatever you call the uniphore. But there are, underneath the uniphore, there are these things that I refer to as holophores. And by the way, this is my private private modeling language. A tree is one of the most profound holophores because all human knowledge systems are based on it. And you could say, well, the cloud isn't based on it. And I'd say, yeah, we could have a discussion about that. But dictionaries, books, knowledge systems, grammar, word lists, we use trees as a fundamental, like set theory, right, is tree-like. It's a fundamental basis from which, words break down into nouns and verbs and adjectives and prepositions and so on. So the tree is a fundamental model within human representational systems, which isn't surprising. We spent most of our early lives as animals in some kind of intimate relationship with trees. Our houses are made of them, our books are made of them. They provide shelter and food and all kinds of astonishing things. In fact, if you look right here, you will see the bodies of trees, right, forming a barrier. And that thing up there is probably filled with tree corpses. So we use tokens to refer to things, and our knowledge in some senses becomes, what's the right word? Over time, a process happens in human knowledge traditions and human intellectual and linguistic behavior that I call artifacting. And artifacting is a lossy compression technology where meaning and relationships and values are lost over time as the tokens with which we refer to phenomenon become denuded of their original dimensionality and richness. And I would argue that our relationship with technology vastly contributes to this. But before we had technology, religion was a pretty good analog of contribution to this, right? So it's not my intention today to go deeply into this theory. This is a personal theory about the nature of human representational consciousness and the problems that we have with language and knowledge and ideas, given our habits and our traditional ways of relating with formal representational cognition. But what I actually was hoping to talk about today are kind of two things. Long ago, when there was a problem, it was known or felt that it was some kind of problem in the between. And it might have a cause, and that cause might be, evil or some particular race of people or something that some people were doing or something that some people were not doing, so on and so forth. But for example, part of the reason we say bless you when someone sneezes is that a long time ago, when people walked near trees, they would often sneeze, and so it was thought that a bad spirit lived in the tree and caused, a kind of little mini curse phenomenon that would result in a sneeze, and a sneeze was a way of trying to get the curse to go away. And, this is a Western Christian idea that became popular just as a kind of common social tradition. But before we had science, the between of people and the wind and the space itself, right? The between. It's really important, this idea of the between, of the between as a dimension that we share. Because in case it isn't obvious, right now there's a huge problem in the pathological between of human beings, but also in the psychosocial between of human beings. And the problem that may very likely exist in the pathological between, I'm going to claim it does, is producing, or is actually a symptom maybe of some other kinds of problems in the between, like us wiping out just about everything that lives and most of, attacking most of what doesn't, 24/7, 365 for the past 100, 150, 200 years. So the between is another word for the between is the environment. And I would argue that some, 80% of whatever it is we might be is directly inherited from that environment, the same way that holophors, metaphors, and analogies, similes, and things inherit qualities from the structured tree of meanings and ideas, distinctions, associations, connotations that they emerge from. We emerge from the environment in a way not dissimilar to how apples emerge from apple trees. So if we fuck up that environment and just obliterate it wantonly for the sake of producing objects or money, which does look peculiarly like tree leaves and has for a long time been printed on paper or made of metal, bad things are going to happen, and they're going to keep happening, and they're going to get worse and worse, and people will blame them on things that more or less have nothing to do with their actual origins, because in general humans are not famous for taking responsibility for the consequences of behavior that should easily be understood to be either insane, not insane in the sense of not clean, although that too, but no, insane in the sense of being an idiot, right? In the Greek sense, a person who lives in a bubble of ideas that can't be true, it's not possible they are true, and then pursues and enacts their relationships based on these nonsensical, dangerous ideas that are the bad kind of crazy. Like our president, right, is the bad kind of crazy. So humans aren't very good at taking responsibility for the consequences of various kinds of insane behavior and ideas. And apparently, many humans think that the way that we live now is the way we will always live, the way we have always lived. None of that is true. It's not possible for that to be true. The way that we live now is explosively unsustainable. And by explosively, I mean a process that becomes geometrically more unsustainable every time you do an iteration. So we're not going to keep living the way that we have been living. And our societies and many of our fundamental principles of what we call our civilization are abjectly at odds with both our nature and the possibility of our own intelligence. Humans are not intelligent by, ex cathedra, by proclamation, right? They're either intelligent or not, depending on what degree of their potential intelligence they're capable of enacting. And in cultures like ours, that percentage is very, very small, right? You're not likely to do something radically different than what everyone around you is doing. And even if you do, it's going to be, by a relatively modest percentage. You might act 5 or 10 or 15%, so to speak, differently from the context you're immersed in. But most of us as human social animals, we acquire our sense of role from our perspective of the context. And so within a given context, that like the context of consumerism and capitalism that we presently exist in, or we may exist in other socio-religious or socio-political or socio-philosophical contexts as well. But we understand the nature and opportunities available to us by looking at the context, right? And then deriving a role from what we see in that context, and then enacting that role over, and usually, we may develop that role. But essentially, humans are limited, most of us, throughout our lives, will be dramatically limited by the contexts, the social and relational and vocational contexts, philosophical, semantic, linguistic, by the contexts that we're exposed to. We're going to be severely limited. And we've always pretended, well, these contexts lift us up, right? These are advanced contexts. They're not. If this was the best we could do, we sucked at doing good, right, in general. People say, well, like we've, wiped out disease, or, we've stopped having wars. None of that's true. We've invented all kinds of toxicity in the environment. We just sort of distributed damage everywhere we could possibly hide it as a species, and then pretended, well, things are getting better and better. And I've read the book Factfulness, right, in which the author claims that our ideas about how bad things are based on misapprehensions and the communication of ideas from like the 30s, 40s, and 50s to our modern ways of evaluating things without including the updated statistics. I get it, right? I'm not ignorant. I can understand charts. And that guy's belief was that actually we're too ignorant to understand if we're just told, so we have to be shown in images. But there's some truth to that. Like, humans respond a lot better to images, or images and language, than they do to language alone. It's almost as if there's an aspect of our intelligence that can instantly grasp images, but has to work relatively hard to grasp statements. And it depends on how well they're crafted, or if analogies are used, or if metaphors are employed, or similes. Because when analogies and similes and metaphors are used, we tend to grasp things more easily. Now, all of the things that I'm talking about right now are stuff in the between. We acquired language by being born into a context where humans were using language all the time. And they were using it in ways that were, while they might seem advanced if we decide to look at them that way, there are places in the behavior that have gone retrograde, right, or regressed. So while we have advanced in certain aspects of our thought and behavior, we have retrogressed, we've gone backwards in others. We've gained value in some domains, we've gained certain kinds of intelligence, but we've lost intimacy with the context of nature, the living places, the environment, perhaps our origin, the nature, the essence of our humanity. These things have been occluded by our rush toward capitalism, consumerism, war, object proliferation, and ramified representational cognition. And all of that's happening in the between. Now, the malaria, the bad air, right, is an idea about the between, right? It's people a long time ago thinking something's wrong in the between of us. Yeah? And maybe they were thinking we're being punished, right? Because often when bad things happen, it certainly feels like a punishment. And right now what's going on is all kinds of confusion. And in case it isn't clear, we are at risk in all kinds of ways. We're at risk from all sorts of things. Our governments are childishly retarded in general, with very few exceptions. The purposes for which they were formed, not only have they failed to accomplish those purposes, they've done pretty much the opposite. They're catastrophically misprepared to do much of anything useful. And, we're using forms of government that were invented in the 1700s in 2020. That's a big mistake. We no longer live in the 1700s. There aren't 1 million people in the United States, or 500,000 or something. I have no idea how many there were when our Constitution was forged. But it's really weird. We've, as human beings, have invested this, what I might call our evolutionary potential, in objects and representations and machines instead of societies that would lift us to where we would start out at a position where we were capable of both recognizing and enacting the incredible potential for intelligence, insight, creativity, nobility, humanity that is our nature. And if we don't build contexts that empower that, then we're going to be limited by their opposites. And we will suffer continuously, generation after generation, we will suffer the catastrophic results of having failed to establish contexts that catalyze the finest qualities that we are capable of and bring as potentials to our human births and lives. And that's tragic when that happens. But right now, the between of humanity is bubbling like a froth. And there's all kinds of conspiracy theories, and there's all kinds of science going on, and there's a reasonable terror that the relatively fascistic aspects of our existing governments will use this as an opportunity, or maybe even engineered this as an opportunity, to clamp down and really create the kind of science fiction nightmare that George Orwell and others of his ilk attempted to warn us about in his book 1984, which was actually about 1948. So, the common people have not yet learned to establish intelligent mini-societal networks among the ordinary population, skillful teams capable of deriving useful intelligence and even directly manipulating the structures they're afraid are about to manipulate them like puppets. We've made thousands of movies about people who do this, just in case this isn't true. Just in case you think what I'm talking about isn't possible. Humans love movies about small 5 to 7 person teams that just walk into some context, manipulate the hell out of it, and walk out with the money. That's something humans are absolutely capable of doing. But instead of doing that, we've been making movies about it, essentially. Writing stories about it. We are really interested in representations. We love representations. And most of our representations are about things we are hungry to participate in, but we are sold the representations, and those kind of settle that hunger a little bit, much in the same way that we're sold porn instead of intimacy, McDonald's instead of food, vitamins instead of nutrition, so on and so forth. So we're living in a time when representations replace the things they represent in our human experience in daily lives. And that activity happens, it arises in the between of individuals, groups, societies, corporations, nations, and so on. I wish you could see all my hand movements. I'm making some great hand movements. But they're not evident at all in this camera, right? I'm making them to myself. Someday I'll get a better camera, but for now, hey. So I'm interested in the between for a number of reasons, and one of them is that I've discovered that the idea of individuals is an extremely limited idea with a relatively poor scope of applicability. And it may turn out to be that the idea of distinctions themselves have a falsified precedence, in that what's really going on is that there's just one human being on Earth, so to speak. There's just one network of human minds of which we are all exponents, right? We are expressions of that, rather than we're a bunch of individuals, and when you look at us as a group, we present these properties that we can analyze or, count. So what I'm trying to get at is, I have discovered that when I am with others, there is this potential that was always I was aware of it subconsciously as a child in play, but I never was able to consciously articulate it, which is that when I'm with one other person and we are really enthusiastically engaged, we form a position above either of us, right? And we play back and forth at enhancing that position, and then that position advances what appears to be our individual intelligences somewhere far below it, right? And so we have the capacity essentially to produce a superposition of intelligence, even with just two human beings, even over 10 minutes, right? It doesn't require any sophisticated technology or understanding. Humans do this naturally whenever they're enthusiastic enough, and enthusiasm does seem to be a key ingredient, whenever they're enthusiastic enough to embark on this adventure together. And it's super exciting. At least all of my experiences of it are. And when that experience is over and I go back to my ordinary seeming individuality, it's like part of me disappears. And I eventually learned to do something similar when I'm making these videos. Instead of actually having a specific other person or other group to interact with, I imagine, right, that others of like mind and interest are with me right now, and I'm playing from the superposition into my my talk, yeah. And that's why I'm excited. And this is what excited speakers do in general, right? They don't always have an audience right in front of them. Certainly when they're composing, right? Authors and other people, musicians and so on, they don't have an audience there yet. They're imagining an audience in the future with which they'll relate. And the audience wants to be lifted to that superposition by the music or the exposition or the poetics. They want to go higher together. Yeah? Humans naturally have this hunger. And what I'm trying to say is that we need to do something other with this hunger than what has been common for so long, and we need to do it together with and for each other and the history and future of life on this world. In other words, we need to do it for a purpose that we can all immediately understand and directly validate is noble. Yeah? Because when we're excited about something that's truly noble, that enthusiasm becomes a force like lift that functions like lift does for aircraft or birds, for a variety of aspects of our intelligence that ordinarily are crawling around in the dirt, trying to, accepting representations instead of flight, yeah, together. The between of the humans right now is in all kinds of storms. And there have always been theories about conspiracy. It's not my intent to dismiss them. That would be egregious, by the way, because I'd have to dismiss thousands of things I haven't even looked at. At the same time, there's a specific aspect of our human intelligence that is vulnerable to what I will call, let's see, what am I going to call this? It's vulnerable to a connectivity gambit, in the sense that we can see some effect occurring, and then somebody can posit or assert some cause or hidden cause or agenda or hidden agenda on the part of some person or people or group. And the part of us that we have an aspect of our intelligence that I refer to sometimes differently. One of the aspects we have is a vetting sentinel. It decides whether something is likely to be true, can be true, is impossible or not. And if that thing gets distorted, if the vetting sentinel gets distorted, then we become vulnerable. Vulnerable to all kinds of violence. But there's another sentinel that I call our threat sentinel. And when those two things get together, the threat sentinel and the vetting sentinel, when the vetting sentinel fails, there's certain kinds of fear and concern that for some human beings, at least, some group, if you just amplify the fear enough, the thing they're afraid of simply becomes real in their minds, right? They're absolutely assured that it's true. And so we have this vulnerability, and it's one of the weaknesses of the sort of fake societies that we're participating in presently is precisely this. We are easily manipulated en masse and individually in general. Just luxuriously touching my face out here, but I haven't touched anything, so I'm not worried about it. Our modern situation places us in a context of incredible vulnerability to a wide array of what, for lack of a better word, I'm just going to call information diseases. And some people will argue, well, the idea that there's actually a pandemic, that's the disease that we're contagiously being affected by. There's no real pandemic. You can't see the virus. Nobody has shown us the actual virus and then used it to cause the same disease that they're saying we have. There's people, making all kinds of wild claims. People's threat sentinels are totally disoriented. Their vetting sentinels are mostly shut down because once you amplify threat enough, the vetting sentinel starts to fail. And these are just words for aspects of our cognitive anatomy, right? So we're in this situation where there's a storm in the between of the humans. And part of that storm is that we've been told, and I believe, that there's a virus circulating that's causing a respiratory syndrome. Now, it may turn out that the actual causal situation is much more complex than that, right? That there are a suite of cofactors that are producing the effects that we're seeing. In my view, that isn't entirely unlikely, but I'm not a virologist or an epidemiologist. In their view, they're looking at it specifically, so far, as a viral contagion caused by a very specific virus that they have isolated RNA from, whether or not they have produced and examined whole viral particles and used those particles to replicate illness in an animal model. But the storm that's happening in the human cognitium, right, in the network of human minds in which we all participate and of which we are all elements, that storm's gigantic. That thing has hundreds of thousands of, maybe millions of different components. And that whole stew is just bubbling right now, right? And nobody knows what to do. There's a lot of energy in that bubbling. If we had some good idea about what to do, and I'd like to suggest that forming small, tightly knit human teams of experts capable of understanding the array of dangers that got us here, understanding the threats and opportunities implicit in representational cognition, the kind that we depend on, rising above, protecting us from the dangers, taking advantage of the opportunities, and directly manipulating the contexts that we have so far been subject to. We're being manipulated by them. I'm saying we should manipulate those contexts intelligently, heroically, and nobly together, just like a team of trustworthy, nobly motivated, and intelligent heroes would do in some story we might write. A story not entirely unlike, for example, Tolkien's work. Yeah. Most of us are frightened and we feel vulnerable, and many of us have lost our livelihoods suddenly, and there's no clear understanding of how we're going to survive without those. It really looks bad in the sense of any kind of predictive. By the way, our threat sentinels, they look at the future, right? They do predictive modeling of threats, and often they get it totally wrong. And sometimes they lead us directly into the threat we're afraid of because they malfunction that way. Mine does occasionally. So we need to be we have to develop intelligence about these aspects of our potential intelligence as humans. We have to learn about their vulnerabilities and their strengths, and we have to employ them in such a way that we take advantage of their strengths and we can have some resistance to their vulnerabilities. And it's a challenging task, believe me. Even with my own mind, it's quite challenging, particularly alone, because I need the input of other intelligent, skillful, creative people to make quick progress along, toward that goal. I can make modest progress by myself if I'm not overwhelmed by other concerns. But when I'm overwhelmed by other concerns, I can regress very quickly. My threat sentinel will malfunction. My vetting sentinel will malfunction. They become overwhelmed, right? Now, the between is actually the thing that stuff we call spirituality is about, in case it isn't clear. It's about the relational dimension that joins all souls, all living beings, all living places, and not just those local to us in time or space. No. That joining is transtemporal. It's beyond time and has little to do with location, although from the perspective of an individual in a specific place and moment, in waking life, it looks like the impact of time and location are extremely important. And in that specific dimension, I won't say they aren't. What I will say is that that's wildly incomplete. And something else is going on. That our dreaming mind or our creative mind, the creative aspects of our intelligence, are much better equipped to sense, relate with, and understand. I can't tell where the origin of the situation, first of all, I can't tell what the scope of the situation we're in now is. I can view it as the and the responses of states and governments and corporations and extremely wealthy individuals and extremely poor individuals, their responses to the situation. Now, obviously the situation is going to breed predators. Obviously there's going to be power grabs. Some of those power grabs could turn out to be catastrophic. We could see both things like very severe examples of martial law. We could see people turn states into prisons. We could see revolution. We're likely to see the full gamut of the possibilities of human, social, and psychological and economic behavior right now, right? If you want to study humans, you're at the best place you've ever been, ever, in the past few thousand years. Because right now we're going to see the full gamut of possibilities. And some of those are going to be noble, but in general, we can reasonably expect that a large number of them won't be noble. They'll be ignoble. And we may be called to give answer to abuse and injustice together. It seems likely we will. And ironically, that idea is part of what is driving the conspiracy engine, right? And most of what's going on in that engine is not only wildly unintelligent or even impossible, it's completely misdirected, right? It takes the human desire to see through oppression and scams, misdirects it, and ironically produces the thing it's pretending to address or resolve. And this is really common with human, psychological and sociological and economic behavior. Irony is everywhere.
I walk around it 4 times.
So, most of us are not probably feeling equipped to take advantage of the opportunities that are currently present. To speak for myself, I am poorly equipped. I'm trying to do something useful in this, with my time. But eventually it's not going to matter whether we feel equipped or not. Eventually we're going to be faced with either relatively stark or relatively beautiful options. And that polarity depends on what we do now with and for each other, how we prepare, what we're preparing to become, in a way not dissimilar to how the biology of a caterpillar transforms inside a chrysalis, right? It's not preparing to become a slug or goop. It turns into goop, and then it reforms and becomes a flying thing. So I think we're in the kind of goopy phase at the moment. Whether we'll become a flying thing or not depends a lot on if we're capable of forming intelligent intentions together, and if we can learn how to enact those intentions in ways that lift us out of the incredibly confused and almost completely misdirected societies and contexts to which we've become habituated. I want that result. I'm willing to work at that result with others of like mind and heart. I want to make of this an opportunity that can lift us beyond the incredibly toxic contexts, activities, and purposes that have become the hallmark of our species in modern times. I don't know if I would say that I am hopeful that we can do this. But I am determined to move in this direction and to explore, and if necessary, to pioneer in this direction with others of like mind and spirit. So I'm just going to give a bit of a roundabout here for a moment. Before I show you the rather troubling thing that I discovered earlier,
So what did you do? Did you leave her? Sorry. Did you leave earlier than expected?
so I've watched so far many people walk past the very troubling thing I discovered when I got here. And I'm not sure what to do about this thing, or if I should do anything about it. In fact, I think I'm not going to show it. Instead, I'll make a separate video of it and not let that shadow here intrude. May you be well. I hope we will all climb a few rungs up the ladder of our human potential during this crisis. But I'm not naive enough to expect that that will occur without some relatively significant impact. All blessings to you.